If someone knocks on your door, you'll remember it, even if you knock on their door during EastEnders or Coronation Street, which is obviously the death of any campaigner.
Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. Now, I suspect a fair number of listeners like me have spent quite a lot of time delivering leaflets adorned with bar charts about how my own party is in with a great chance of winning the election. But does all this sort of campaigning make any difference? Do the public really change their expectations of who might win? Well, we're about to find out. As on the show this time is someone with a fresh piece of research all about campaigning momentum. It's Professor Justin Fisher. Welcome back to the podcast, Justin.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for inviting me.
So this new research that's maybe about to tell me I've wasted hours and hours and days and weeks and months of my life. What's your new research all about?
Well, spoiler alert, you haven't wasted your time. In fact, it's been really profitable. So what we were interested in was how campaigns or whether campaigns could boost the viability of parties or candidates, particularly at the constituency level. And what I mean by viability is the extent to which people think they are a reasonable choice and a choice that has some chance of winning. And what research from both the UK but also around the world tells us that if one of the things that parties have to do is project viability in order to attract voters. Voters are much less likely to support candidates or parties who they think have no chance whatsoever of winning. So we were interested in the extent to which the campaigns made a difference. And what struck us when looking at the literature on this was it was very much about what we call bandwagon effects. And what those are the idea that as candidates or parties become more popular, voters flock to them. And we thought that that was only a partial picture. And it was a partial picture because we thought that actually what campaigns might do is also, as we found from our other research, shore up the vote or attract people in different ways, but also thinking about how people who weren't going to vote for that party might perceive their new opposition. Now, a good way to think of this is actually a sporting analogy. I always say to my students that football helps explain elections really, really well. So if you can indulge me for a moment, let's say there were two football teams. One was a remarkably strong football team. Let's call that team Brentford. And one was a relatively weak team. Let's call that team Queen's Park Rangers.
Is there some local football rivalry sneaking into your analogies, Justin?
Rivalry is one way of putting it, but of course, Queen's Park Rangers are in a lower division than Brentford, as you know.
Factual accuracy.
Factual. So a citizen might consider that over 2 points in time, Brentford, the strong team, are the likely victor in a forthcoming match. But over the course of those 2 points in time, they perceive that QPR's chances of achieving a shock victory have increased by virtue of them having bought a star player or a new manager. Now, this might diminish the perceptions of the chances of a Brentford victory, but the expectation is that they will still win. Now, the reason that matters is, in this case, the weaker party or weaker team in this context would have greater viability, but people could perceive that they were getting stronger even if they weren't going to themselves vote for them. So we were interested in the process by which people started to judge the ability to win or do better in an election.
And that's really interesting because I guess what you're capturing are all three elements of the hopeful impact of a Lib Dem bar chart in once. Because, I think often I say to people that, people think that a bar chart is about tactical voting, that you're basically the audience for the bar chart is the party that the bar chart portrays hopefully accurately as being in third place to say to those supporters, don't vote for them, vote for us. But there are actually two other purposes of the bar chart, which are about, saying that party 3 is less likely to win. Also about saying, actually, it's between party 1 and 2, and therefore it makes sense to pick between one of them. But it's saying to supporters of party 2, it's okay, you can vote for the other rival party because party 3 is out of the race. So it's it's in a way a different message to supporters of party two, and to supporters of party one, it's saying, well, look, you're in with a chance of winning. Vote for us. You can back a winner, and it's worth you going to vote and so on. And I think all three of those are quite different mechanics in a way that, and your viability measure is in a sense judging the impact therefore of the viability of each of the three parties, and therefore I guess is a much more subtle measure than one that is about, say, perceived levels of tactical voting, and does that go up or down during a campaign?
That's right. In fact, there's actually a fourth
Mm,
mechanism, and that is related to what we call expressive voting. And what we're interested in there is if you are the supporter of a slightly less popular party, um, one of the things in a
mm,
constituency you suffer from is a lack of information.
mm,
So most opinion polls, and I know we're going to come on to this later,
mm,
don't go down to the
mm,
constituency level. So the best source of information you have is from the campaign or from discussions with other people. Now, what a strong campaign can do is make you realize that you're not alone. If you thought you were the only Liberal Democrat in the
mm,
constituency, or the only Labour supporter, or the only
mm,
Green, or whatever, if you see that the party is campaigning, you realize that other people share your
mm,
worldview. And that can lead you to be more likely to support your team because you feel that you're one of many rather than
mm.
a lone supporter
Yeah.
of the Lib Dems, the
Yeah.
Greens,
And
Labour.
that's your classic marketing effect, isn't it? That in the sort of commercial world, the be like all these other people is a very standard sort of marketing tactic, isn't it?
Absolutely. So one of the best books on this, written nearly 25 years ago now, compared this to the effect of what records people put on a jukebox in a particular Brooklyn cafe. It was one that was frequented mainly by Italian Americans, and they would always play New York by Frank Sinatra because that's what everybody else liked. And if his argument was that this made you feel part of a gang,
Yeah.
part of a team.
And what was the book, by the way? I don't recognize that analogy. I feel there's a book I've missed that I should have read.
It's called The Logic of Expressive Action, and it's a fascinating book. It's a sort of counterpoint to a very famous book from the 60s called The Logic of Collective Action. And it's a really interesting way of thinking about how people coalesce around a team.
Yep. How interesting. So if if we sort of use the concept that you talk about, what is it that parties or candidates can do to generate their momentum? Obviously, I've thrown in already, of course, the example of delivering lots of leaflets with bar charts on. But I know one of the other bits of research you do that's absolutely fascinating. And if anyone listening to this is an election agent, if you ever get a survey from Justin, please fill in and return that survey because you do all sorts of interesting analysis from your agent surveys. But and I know you've got a lot of expertise in party finance as well. So drawing on all of that, different insight that you have, what is it that successfully generates momentum?
Well, from a party perspective, it's visibility. So you've mentioned
Mm,
leaflets, but it's also seeing people in and around the constituency. Those street stalls on a
mm,
Saturday morning in a busy street are a good way of doing that.
mm,
But perhaps one that's underplayed, but I think is terrifically important, is what the literature calls yard boards. They're
mm.
like estate agent signs. I'm not sure if there's a proper UK term. Yard boards
Like,
sounds
well,
very American.
stake boards is certainly the Lib
Stake
Dem
boards.
phrase. I think that's used in other parties as well. But
Well, those can be incredibly effective. I mean, to give you an example, for a variety of reasons, I happen to find myself driving quite regularly through the Southwest London corridor
mm,
during the election campaign. And what was very clear, particularly on the roads, the
mm,
commuter routes that I took, was that there were Lib Dem boards everywhere.
mm,
And that really created visibility and a sense in which the party was potentially going to do well. Why would all these
mm,
people put these up if they weren't on the cusp of doing well? Which, of course,
mm,
it turns out the Liberal Democrats did. Now, I sort of slightly jokingly refer in the article to the Lib Dems winning here
mm,
caption, but actually
mm,
it's quite an effective thing to do. I think the trick is that it's not overdone, that it's not sort of proclaimed in a seat where there's absolutely no chance whatsoever.
Mm.
But we quote in an article someone called M. Pack.
Who is that chap?
Who is this strange masked man? And he says, posters make you look like a winner.
Mm.
And I think that's actually really, really strong advice. Just the visibility is a key bit of information for the voter to see what's going on in their constituency. And it's based on the assumption that if people are advertising and promoting their product, they must think they're going to do well, because the voter doesn't have that detailed constituency information at that particular level. They may have lots and lots at national level, but at constituency level, it's rather less. So I think visibility is the key thing. Now, of course, in many ways, what we think is the breakthrough in this paper is not so much that we think these things are important, but that if you combine them all together, you can see clear empirical advice that the more people are exposed to campaigns, the better they think those parties will do. And that works for all three parties in all three elections. I mean, in the Conservative case in 2019, it misses out slightly on statistical significance. But for Labour and the Liberal Democrats, in all the three elections we examine, there's a very, very clear pattern.
And what's the data that you're pulling on to do that analysis?
We draw on the British election study, and we use their panel waves, which something like, we just focused on England in this analysis. There's something like 15,000 citizens in each wave. And we look at the difference between the wave at the start of the campaign and the wave at the end. So what we're interested in is, because of the exposure that people have received, does their assessment of who's likely to do well in the constituency change over the course of the campaign? And by the campaign, I mean the short campaign. And that's absolutely the case. And in the case of the Liberal Democrats, actually, it changes quite rapidly.
Yeah, and I will include a link in the show notes to the article, so particularly Lib Dem listeners can look at your graph that shows the particularly steep line for Lib Dems and feel like the listeners were worth it. I do wonder though, so the BES data, if I remember correctly, I mean, it's very high quality, authoritative. It's sort of the gold standard research, isn't it? But in terms of measuring the impact of campaigns, it uses questions that are basically yes, no. So it's, have you been canvassed by this party? Did you get a leaflet from this party? And my sort of gut feel is that that probably underplays campaign effects, because the campaign effect of one leaflet versus 20 leaflets should be that 20 is much more than one. But in both cases, the answer to the question is just the yes rather than no. Now, of course, the more leaflets you get, the more likely you are to get a yes, because if somebody gets one leaflet, they may forget, overlook, whatever. But I do always wonder if that, boiling it down to binary yes-no questions, feels to me like it's likely to be taking the edge off picking out what's happening in the really intensive campaigns. And it's worth saying, I mean, I know you'll know this, and many listeners will know this, but for other listeners, I mean, it is literally the case that there will be some seats where they maybe do the one free post election address, and the really full-on campaign, if you're a really unlucky voter who always tells the canvasser that you're undecided, which is the worst thing to do if you want to get politicians off your doorstep, by the way, never say you're unsure. I mean, 30 is probably not an exaggeration in the sort of the 8 to 10 weeks running up to polling day. So how much do you worry that the BES data may, in a sense, be underplaying the impact, given it relies on the yes/no question?
Well, I think that the first thing is that we don't just use the yes/no question. So within the BES data, in the elections we analysed here, there are 7 questions about contact. And what we were able to do was create a quite sophisticated mathematical model, which effectively estimated how difficult it was for people to experience the most intense form of campaigning, which generally speaking is on the doorstep.
And those 7 are different, so as in leafleting and canvassing, etc., different forms of
absolutely, 7 different forms. And so what we're able to do is produce not just what we call an additive scale, where we add them all together, but we're able to estimate the likelihood of them experiencing more of them, and particularly the more extensive, the more intense ones. Now, we think this is a real sort of move forward methodologically in measuring this, and we're very pleased with the outcome. But I have to say, we've always shared some of your
Mm,
concerns about volume as well as presence. And so in the
mm,
2024 British election study, we were successful in inserting new questions which not only captured presence but scale. And so there are many, many more variables
mm,
with which you can work. So we think we've got a very good measure. It's not just yes
mm.
or no, but it looks at a range of measures and differentiates the harder ones from just getting
Yeah.
something through the post.
And
But moving forward, there will be even more
excellent.
sophisticated data.
And presumably, what you'll also be able to do, therefore, is both do a model with the more sophisticated data, but also you can dumb the data down to yes, no, and see whether the old yes, no analysis would, does give different results from the more sophisticated, which.
That's right. Although our expectation is that the difference overall
Mm,
will probably be fairly small,
mm,
because one of the things in our other work,
mm,
we're always asked, should we be
mm.
doing more leaflets or
Yeah,
should we be doing more social media or whatever? And the truth is, it's incredibly difficult to disaggregate. And a
absolutely.
far more reliable measure is not whether or not you were leafleted or not, but whether or not you experienced a whole range of different activities. We're interested in intensity rather than did you see them
Yeah.
or not.
And do you
So,
think that is because I guess there are two different possible reasons, and the truth might be a mix of both, as to why people who have been exposed to more different types of campaigning have a bigger impact on them. One is simply that variation is beneficial because if you've been canvassed and leafleted and walked past a street stall and four of your neighbours have posters up, that all adds up to much more. The other is that all of those are basically correlated with leaflet volume, that the more intense the leafleting campaign, the more likely it is to be doing the other things. And so it might be, and indeed, there's lots of other correlations within that. So it might be that it's actually really one of those methods is the really powerful one, but because the more that you do of it, the more you tend to have a bigger team into doing the others. And therefore, it might not actually be that the mix, that the variety is the key thing. So do you have a sense of whether it is really about variety that.
well, we know that all of from our other work, that all the way in which we create our measure of
Mm,
campaign
mm,
intensity is to create a whole range of different types of
mm,
campaigning and assess to the extent to which that they correlate with each other
mm.
in terms of a sort of underlying
Yeah.
intensity model. And it's important that they do, otherwise we would have to have more than one measure of
Yeah.
intensity. So they are all correlated, and you're absolutely right. If you do a lot of one thing, you're likely to do a lot
Mm,
um, of another. So yes, I, there is a good reason why we tend to focus on a range of things and
mm,
intensity, and part of that is actually recall.
mm,
And now, in our aggregate work, which is
mm,
based on what the parties themselves do, that's not an issue. But where you're asking voters, as we
mm.
are in this
Yeah.
work, they may recall different types of contact or
Mm,
exposure at different levels. So typically, you mentioned
mm,
leaflets. Typically, leaflets, people used to say, well, do people ever remember
mm,
those? Do they go
mm,
straight in the recycling?
mm,
And the same questions are now being asked about digital
mm,
content, the extent to which people remember that. Ironically, there is a view in some parties that actually things like leaflets now have a stronger
mm,
recall because people receive less posts than they used to. And
mm.
so there's almost a novelty. I've got a
Yeah.
letter that's come through. But what comes through very strongly, both in our research and also research in other countries, is the thing that people remember the most is the personal contact.
Now that is, I mean, in one sense, I'm not surprised to hear you say that, but also in a way, it is slightly paradoxical because one of the things that I particularly liked about your article was how it showed that Lib Dem campaigning seemed to be more successful typically than that of other party at generating this increased in perceived chance of winning. And you might also expect that given the Lib Dems have fewer members than Labour and the Conservatives, and members is probably in some way a proxy for non-member helpers as well, that therefore, if in-person canvassing is the real cause of impact, that actually the Lib Dems would suffer, and it would logically set up a set of graphs in which you see the Lib Dems as being the worst performers. So flatter my ego and many of my listeners' egos by, as it were, how do you reconcile the two? What is it that makes the Lib Dem campaign so effective?
Before I fatten your ego, I'll depress it slightly. So it's often true, particularly in the elections we looked at, 15, 17, and
Mm.
19, that Liberal Democrat candidates were starting at a lower
Yeah,
base.
that
And
makes
so
sense.
the rate of improvement was always going to be greater. However, one of the things that the Liberal Democrats have always been extremely good at is targeting their efforts.
Mm.
So campaigning where they need to, not necessarily where they'd like to.
Mm.
And that, I think, really, really helps. Now, of course, with that comes the difficulty of how you move resource. People may not necessarily want to go and campaign some distance away from their home. And that is always a challenge. But where I think the Liberal Democrats have always been pretty good is getting people out. But as I say, going back to this visibility, when the Lib Dems are in play in a seat, you can always tell because you can't move
Mm.
for orange stake boards and all of the other paraphernalia. That sort of stuff really, really helps. So, yes, the Liberal Democrats are, I guess, at a natural disadvantage because they have fewer
Mm.
members, although in the past they've been more successful than others in
Mm.
recruiting supporters. But doing the campaigning where you really need to is a great way of doing
Mm.
that. And I think moving forward, that can become more of a challenge because of your success at the last general election,
Yeah, and
defeating
and I
ending
and I and
73
I
seats.
guess the way to think about member and supporter numbers is maybe member and supporters in total per target seat. And in that sense, we had our best result for a century, but we won a number of seats. Amazing for us, but if either Labour or Tory had won that number of seats, it would have been an utter catastrophe for either of them, and therefore their resources might be bigger, but they are stretched much, much
Yes,
more
yeah,
broadly. Plus, I think there is, as you say, probably a genuine difference of culture, both in terms of volume of activity that the hardcore activists do, but also that willingness to target.
yes, it's incredibly
Yeah.
important. I mean, all parties need to target, but I mean, in our analysis
Mm.
on the effectiveness of campaigns in general, what we've shown consistently is that the Liberal Democrat campaigns in their
Mm.
target seats have been as strong, if not stronger, than the targeted campaigns of the other two parties.
Yeah. And we have I have at least, sorry, you were the rigorous academic with your concepts. I have slightly blurred the distinction between momentum and increased perception that you've got a chance of winning on the one hand, and actually winning on the other. Now, the former can go up or down without necessarily affecting the latter. So, how much does it matter? And I guess for a smaller party, it particularly matters. So, in a way, the most interesting question is perhaps how much does it matter for a big party where the public's default might be to think, oh, well, they probably are a chance, got a chance of winning because they're the government or whatever. So, does all of this, increased perception actually result in more votes and more winners?
I mean, short answer, yes, it does result in more votes, but it's because it creates the mechanism to enable a number of things to happen.
Mm.
So one of those could well be a bandwagon.
Mm.
So if we take my Southwest London
Mm.
corridor example, it may be that you create a bandwagon such as the people increasingly move towards the Liberal Democrats in Epsom,
Yeah.
for example. It creates the perception of greater
Mm.
viability in strategic contests, in tactical contexts. So, is it worth voting Liberal Democrat if I want to defeat X party. So that matters, and our evidence suggests that can boost votes. As I said, the expressive voting as well, all of those things combined creates the conditions for a successful campaign. And our other evidence, which looks at the role of intensity in terms of changing vote share, there's clear evidence that the more you campaign, the better you do. So what we've uncovered here is part of the reason that helps explain not just why you do, not just that you do better, but also why you do better. And by you, I mean any party that campaigns more intensely.
And I guess there's a bit of strategic context as well. So I think thinking about some of the more surprising Lib Dem wins at the last general election, where the campaign intensity was relatively modest compared to what was happening in the absolute full-on, had been a target seat for years and years situation. I think in those places, particularly now that you've got the election results to look back on and say, oh, we did win, the key thing is not so much how much we were doing, the Lib Dems were doing, but that firstly, the electorate in the seat had decided we don't want to vote Tory anymore. And therefore, the question is not how much are the Lib Dems doing, it's how much are the Lib Dems doing relative to Labour or Reform or the Greens or Nationalists perhaps as well in Scotland and Wales. And that's a much lower bar. So in a lot of the in those sort of surprise Lib Dem wins with relatively modest Lib Dem campaigns, you see almost zero Labour campaigning. And so if the public had essentially already, for national reasons, maybe personal reasons, perhaps in terms of personal experience of the NHS, but, for not constituency campaign specific reasons, decided I don't want to vote Tory. Well, okay, seeing 3 Lib Dem posters but 0 Labour posters, the mere 3 could be enough.
Certainly. I mean, I think the example you illustrate highlights a really important thing about British elections, which journalists often get wrong. So they often talk about electoral pacts. And the truth is, electoral pacts are rarely extensive and rarely work and serve often to upset activists in various parties. But at the same time, the idea that there hasn't been effectively sort of a tacit withdrawal from a party really betrays the fact that you clearly see targeted efforts. And by targeted, I mean also doing more in some seats, but also doing much less in others. And so that's much more likely to happen than a formal pact between the Liberal Democrats and Labour or whatever, which is never going to happen. So yes, it is a relative amount, but of course, it would almost certainly take more than 3 posters, but it would give you a stronger impression that the Liberal Democrats can do well rather than in this case Labour, because you didn't see any of their campaigning going ahead.
And indeed, it might not even necessarily be campaign activity in your own constituency. I mean, I think one of our surprise wins, a significant part of the story is that a large number of voters in that constituency commute into a nearby large urban area. I'm trying to be sufficiently anonymous about this, a nearby large urban area, which had a very intense Lib Dem campaign and a massive poster site. And actually, if in your morning commute, from maybe a third of the way through your commute, you start seeing loads of Lib Dem posters, you're probably not thinking, oh, I've entered another constituent. You can see how that effect may make you feel like in your own seat, because it's in your own commute journey that you see that there. And so I think that helps explain why, in that seat that we did win, relatively modest levels of campaigning compared to the the much more urban seat. But that was because there was that bleed over. And also, if you talk to people, there are all sorts of other ways in which those campaign effects can bleed out into other areas. I think it's John Curtis has sort of, talked about the Lib Dem success on maps looking like an outbreak of measles. That sense of spatial contagion, I think, is the more academic phrase, isn't it? And I guess that might be part of what you're picking up as well, therefore.
Definitely. I mean, you mentioned commuting. Apart from anything else, lots of people work outside of the constituency in which they vote. So my constituency where I live is Ealing North, but I work in Uxbridge and South Ruislip. And so you can get contagion It's true there.
What a fascinating pair of constituencies for somebody studying elections. You've done well there. You've done well there, Justin.
Well, I mean, interestingly, Ealing
Mm,
North used to be a bellwether seat.
mm,
Until 97, it was a
yeah.
bellwether seat. And now, like many London seats, it's very solid. Uxbridge, I have to say, was something of a surprise to
Mm,
me in terms of the result, given the by-election
mm,
that happened, a year or so previously. But, this was an election of surprises.
mm,
And so I guess one shouldn't be as surprised that
yeah.
Uxbridge changed hands, even though it had been Conservative
Mm,
since 1970.
yeah. And well, talking of surprises, I guess one other semi-surprise of the election was just the sheer volume of MRP polls.
Yep.
And so this, although an MRP poll is not the same as a constituency poll, definitely they are different things, but from the point of view of your typical voter, an MRP poll is giving you data about who may or may not be in with a chance of winning in your seat compared to in a similar way to which a constituency poll would do that. And it also has an apparent sort of third party stamp of authenticity about it, that this isn't just a party saying it, it's some other, it's a polling
Mhm.
company has said it. And I think we've not really got our heads round what long-term impact that might have on British politics if high
Mm.
volumes of MRPs are the norm,
Yep.
because that's a very different sort of information landscape against which campaigns are then trying to shift the perceived chances of winning and so on. Also a big question about how inaccurate some of the MRPs were, and questions about whether it's actually a public good to have inaccurate MRPs out there and so on. But leaving aside the potential polling controversies, what's your sense of what sort of difference, if any, the MRPs either did make this time or might make in the future if we have that sustained volume?
Well, I think you're certainly right. The volume of MRPs in this election was greater than ever
Mm,
before, and I think there is great potential there for there to be electoral effects, because in effect there is a new source of information for voters in a
mm,
constituency that didn't really previously exist. Um, Having said that, I think there are two sort of things that one needs to be careful about. The first is the extent to which voters in any constituency take note of them. So you and I would, and your colleagues in your party would, and
mm.
your activists would, but in many senses, we're
Yeah,
unusual.
absolutely.
And so many voters, they won't even register. So interest in politics is important here, is a key variable. Awareness of them, depending on where they're
Mm,
published, for example. I think the second thing to be wary of is something that you drew our attention to. There were a lot of MRP polls, and the accuracy of them, well, not the accuracy, the the story they told varied quite
mm,
considerably. And so there were good MRP polls, and ones that told a story that even the parties didn't really believe.
mm,
And I think that can be a danger. Not well, danger is the wrong word. If there continue to be lots of polls that are telling rather different
mm,
stories, that is likely to create a credibility
mm,
problem amongst the or those
mm,
electors who look at these polls. So there are lots of examples where MRP polls in the last election said, this is
mm,
what was going to happen, and people said, oh, this is fantastic. But equally, in the 2019
mm,
election, and I know this because we looked closely at it,
mm,
many of them confidently predicted that Labour would win Uxbridge and South
mm,
Ruislip, which of course they didn't. They
mm,
did. The Conservatives lost in 2024, but in
mm,
2019
mm,
it was way off course. So I think if you get uh, wide variation in the stories that they're telling, it can damage the credibility of them, and therefore paradoxically might make voters less receptive to them. Now, I know, for example, that political parties such as your own
mm,
trust some
mm,
MRP producers more than
mm.
others, but it would be unlikely that the voters would have that kind of discrimination
Yeah,
between them,
yeah.
and it can, I think, create problems for parties.
Mm,
Because if the activists are looking at all of them and they say, look, the poll by Joe Blogg's MRP says that the Liberal Democrats are going to win Ealing North, for the sake of argument. Now, for those of your listeners who aren't aware, Ealing North is classic LabCon seat.
But an excellent local Liberal Democrat council group that is making good progress.
Making good progress. This creates a difficulty for parties because the activists there might say, well, actually, we've now got a chance in Ealing North. Let's do something. And of course, managing the part, one of the things the Liberal Democrats have been incredibly successful at doing is channeling their resources effectively. And in effect, these new sources of information, if they are inaccurate, can make that job a lot more difficult. And so I think it remains to be seen how effective they are, but I think it could go one of two ways.
And I think one thing that sort of heightens that dilemma is that media coverage of MRPs is fairly unsophisticated. I think partly because it's the classic, a media outlet commissions an MRP, and therefore that's the one thing they talk about, and you don't run the story about, well, actually, there are these other MRPs that some other folk commissioned previously from rival outlets, and they look like they might be more plausible. Everyone has to talk up the thing that they've commissioned. But also, even for journalists who are not having to cover, as it were, their own MRP, I think there's a real gap between at least their current level of knowledge and the level of knowledge one would hope for really intelligent mainstream political coverage, by which I mean, obviously, you're not going to expect mainstream coverage to get into really detailed statistical, analysis. But it was very striking that if you take, say, the ICM MRP during the election, which got generally quite positive write-ups because, sorry, not ICM, Ipsos, betraying my age there by saying ICM, Ipsos, very reputable polling firm, good pedigree, all of that. They did an MRP, got reputable. But when you dug into the details, what the story it was telling about the Lib Dems was just weird, because it was on the one hand saying we would have quite a successful election and we would do something like treble our number of MPs, but also in a whole load of marquee top target seats that had had regular visits from Ed Davey and so on. So, no secret that these were the absolute sort of crown jewels of our targeting operation, that we would blame out, crash and burn, and Labour would leapfrog us. And you sort of think, what on earth is the story here, that we're both meant to have a really successful night, yet our marquee efforts are meant to crash and burn? And I think that's a level at which it would be reasonable to hope that in future political journalism may be a bit more savvy and may help to distinguish between MRPs, perhaps.
I think your hopes may be frustrated because the reporting of polls in general,
indeed,
has difficulties. I mean, as you'll know, a very small shift in one poll can create a great news story.
Yeah.
Unless it's a trend, we don't know.
Yeah, there's a fantastic Daily Express story from earlier this year before the election when the Tories were up one, and the word used was surge.
Absolutely. So I mean, you won't suppress them, and I think there was some talk either during the election or soon after about whether or not that should be regulated. I don't think you can. My feeling is that it's more likely that the market will regulate the level of MRP polling, because as with political polling, if your MRP is shown to be rather inaccurate, it's not good for business. And it's always important to remember that for polling companies, their big business is not politics. It's all of the other stuff that they do. That's what generates income. So no polling company wants bad publicity.
And we should say, in fairness, that the most high-profile MRP is the YouGov MRP, and over the 3 elections it's now, been running, it's had a stonkingly good record. It has been very good. It's not perfect, but very, very good. And if that was your only source of information as to what's going to happen in an election, you would probably have been better informed than if you'd been following a whole range of news with a whole load of variable quality other bits of information thrown in.
Definitely. Most polling is good most of the time. And, let's not forget that the exit polling, which is done in conjunction between academics and polling companies, is remarkably accurate. I mean, stunningly accurate, and has been so for some years. So most polling is good most of the time. But unfortunately, just as in in business,
Mm.
in politics. A poor run can have longer running
Yeah.
consequences.
Yeah.
So I think my suspicion is that the market will sort this out.
Yeah. I will resist the temptation to dive down the rabbit hole of the problem the exit poll had this time with the Lib Dem performance in some seats, and instead ask you, so based on both this research and your other extensive research about what happens in campaigning and what does and doesn't work, if you had one campaigning tip for the Lib Dems, maybe it's something that we do but we get wrong, or something that we don't do, what would be, looking at your research, what would be your top tip for us?
Well, I shudder to give a tip when your party has won the most seats of any third party since 1923, which would suggest to me that the Liberal Democrats are doing an awful lot right.
Hmm.
So if I had a tip, it would be keep doing what you're good
Hmm.
at, you're extremely good at, which is targeting and
Hmm.
visibility. But if there was, I guess, one tip, and that this is true of all parties, but it's something that the Lib Dems have suffered from in the past, and that is be aware of what you can do and don't be tempted to go further and risk that. And that's an example that came from 2010.
Hmm.
So in 2010, when Nick Clegg performed so well in the leaders' debates, the range of target seats expanded. There was what we call a bandwagon effect
Hmm.
there, at least initially. And as a result, the Liberal Democrats did worse than they probably should have done. Now, it's, as I say, it's very difficult to say this in the light of such a
Hmm.
spectacular result for the Liberal Democrats. I think the challenge for you in the next election is keeping all of those, but perhaps building only slightly. I think the likelihood of having another such a spectacular result is probably less certain.
Hmm.
But who
Yeah, no,
knows?
I think that's a
I
very
mean,
fair point. It's
I should say in our to your listeners, in our conversations before the election, Mark, I confidently predicted that you could well get 40 seats, and of course, I was proved
well,
hopelessly wrong. So
we did. We just got, somewhat more on top of
33 more
that.
of them.
But I think you're absolutely right, and that was a running sort of train of thought through all of the planning during the general election campaign itself. Was this, well, so often in the past we've been over ambitious and spread our resources too thinly, 2010 being the classic example, but sadly not the only one. And oh my goodness, we mustn't make that mistake this time. We mustn't make that mistake this time. Now, obviously, now that we know the result, you sort of think, well, all the very reasonable questions are, well, should we have, maybe relaxed a little bit more, a little bit sooner, and so on. But I think you're right. The form book is still that the risk is of over ambition rather than under ambition. That over ambition is the bigger, the form book tells us is the bigger risk. But it's very nice to have had a bit of variation into that form book this July.
And congratulations on such a spectacular result.
Yeah, and I'm sure we can in some way put it down to the fact that so many Lib Dems diligently read your research. So if you need a sworn affidavit for an impact statement at some point, I'm sure there's a queue of Lib Dem campaigners who will be happy to swear that they've read your articles.
Well, that's kind, but I'd also point out, you have a fantastic team at Liberal Democrat headquarters, and they play an enormously important role in coordinating everything and making sure it happens. Having met so many of them over the years, they are incredibly impressive.
I will, on that, feels to me like that's the perfect note, therefore, on which to end. So thank you hugely for your time, Justin. I will
My
include
pleasure.
for listeners in the show notes a link to the article that we've been talking about that has Justin and his colleagues' research, as well as to the BES and some more information about the accuracy of MRP polls and so on. You can also find Justin on Twitter at Justin_T_Fisher, and myself you can find online at markpack.org.uk. And if you like listening, please do tell others about the podcast and give it a rating or review in your favourite podcast app to help feed those algorithm gods. Thank you, everyone, for listening.